Okay, now it's time to talk about the 4 triggers of addiction. So these 4 triggers, we've talked now about how our emotions are connected to addiction. That we get really emotionally dysregulated in our lives just by virtue of being alive and being human. And then we find ourselves in a place where we are so dysregulated that we need relief so badly that we're willing to do anything to get that. Even turn to an addiction, which is often going to cause destruction and harm in our life. That's because for a moment, for a brief moment, that addiction delivers, and we know it delivers. So now we need to back up a little bit. We're going to start taking more responsibility for our emotions so that we can see what's going on and we can see this thunderstorm that's sending us into our addiction. Now, the first part that we need to recognize in being able to address the thunderstorm is to be able to really identify the emotions that are really moving through us and sending us into a place where we need relief. So the 4 triggers really come down to 4 key emotions. Now I will tell you that these emotions, when I identify them, some of them are going to need some deep explanation, and we're going to get into them in the next videos, the next several videos. But when I say them to you, withhold judgment and let me explain a little bit first before we start thinking, what the heck, where did these come from, and why are we saying everything is these 4? Okay, so here are the 4. Now remember, hold off judgment. The 4 are fear, resentment, selfishness, and dishonesty. Now, that sounds kind of weird, and it probably sounds a little bit oversimplified. So I'm going to tell you first, where did I come up with these 4? And also, how can it just distill down to 4? Because I'm going to say many times throughout this course and the following courses that everything in our life that dysregulates us comes down to those 4 triggers. Every mistake we ever make comes down to one of those 4 triggers. Now, when I say a mistake, I don't mean an accident. I don't mean we're drawing on paper and oops, we did a T when we meant to do an I. What I mean are the things that we do that we know we made a wrong decision. We know we did something that we didn't want to do or didn't mean to do in a way that, oh, we kind of wish we could go back and change that. Every time we make a decision like that we know it didn't serve our best selves or didn't serve someone else, those are really being motivated by those same things. So the mistakes that we make, the emotions that dysregulate us, all of these things come back down to those 4 things: fear, resentment, selfishness, and dishonesty. Now, where did I come up with these 4 things? Especially because this might be the first time you've been hearing about this. Okay, so let me tell you, those 4 triggers, they are identified in the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, that's a program that was originated in 1918. It has gone on to serve hundreds and thousands of people throughout its lifetime. The 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous has been taken and adapted to various different addictions across the world. Think of anything you could think of. There's a 12-step program for narcotics. There's a 12-step program for overeating. There's a 12-step program pretty much for anything you can think of that would cause an addiction. Now, the reason for that, the reason why what was once founded in 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous can be so universally applied to all of these other areas is because none of the 12 steps is actually addiction specific. There's only one step of the 12 that even mentions addiction at all, and that's the first step. The first step says, oh wow, you realize that you have a problem and you can't fix it on your own. Everything else from there is just a bunch of resources and steps that will help you to overcome your addiction. So where does the 4 triggers come in? Well, the 4 triggers come in when you get to the point in the program where you come into what's called the maintenance steps. So the 12 steps of addiction recovery, they are kind of sorted into 2 categories. You have phase 1 and phase 2. The first part of the 12 steps is really focused on helping you kind of get a jump start in cleaning out some of your old baggage, where the last part of the program is really focused on that daily living to help you live in a place where you're staying resilient to your addiction and living a pretty good life. So you'll do those daily practices for the rest of your life. That's where you find reference to those 4 triggers. In step 10 of the 12-step program, it talks about how you must live vigilantly, always checking yourself and your life for the appearance of fear. and selfishness and resentment and dishonesty, because those things will knock you out of your serenity. Those things will cause you to make mistakes. Those things will cause you to feel so emotionally dysregulated that you just need relief. So that is where we find the 4 triggers of addiction. Now, again, it does seem to be oversimplifying a really big problem, especially if I asked you, what do you resent in your life right now, or what are some things that you're struggling with, or what are some emotions you felt even in the last 24 hours that weren't comfortable, you're probably going to think of a list that's a whole lot bigger than just those 4, right? I'm sure that you will. So let me say it this way. That's what everything deconstructs down to. Everything deconstructs down to those 4. Just like if you're a person of faith, maybe you've heard something called the Bible before. Well, if you have or if you haven't, I hope that this story will serve you. So in the Bible, there is a young man who comes to the Lord and he says, Lord, what is the greatest commandment? He's probably been to some of the sermons that Jesus has been teaching, or maybe he's aware that, there are a lot of commandments out there. He's probably hearing a lot of do's and a lot of don'ts, and he's wondering, man, there's so many to do, there's so many to follow. How do I know which one is the most important one? How do I know where to start? And the Lord says, hey, there's not 1, there's 2, and I'll tell you what they are. The first one is love God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength. And then the second one, similar, love your neighbor as yourself. So the Lord says there's not just 1, there's actually 2. And because really those 2 kind of go hand in hand, right? The Lord says, hey, if you can do those, pretty much all the other commandments are going to stem from those. So when in doubt, focus on those 2. Love everybody else and love God. And you'll be bringing everything into an alignment in your life that you can't go wrong. Now, that means all those commandments, and we know there's a whole lot more commandments, right? Whether you're a person of faith or not a person of faith, you've probably seen a Bible. It's about that big. Now, if the Bible was going to be consisting of only just 2 commandments, it wouldn't even be a whole page. That would be the whole entry. Love God, love everyone else, the end. So we have a great big book of a Bible. So there are a lot more commandments in there than just those 2. But we do know, we identify those, okay, those are the 2 great commandments, as the Lord says. So similarly, the 4 triggers, that's really what everything deconstructs down to. The things that go wrong in our life, the mistakes that we make, the emotional nests that we feel, they all deconstruct down to those 4. Now, I'll give you a brief example of this, and then we're going to go through all 4 of these triggers, each one independently, so you get a really good understanding of what each one is, what it looks like and feels like in your life. Now, at the end of the course, or after that next section, what you'll find is several examples. I'm going to give you one example here, but then we're going to break down several examples in the end, so you can still start to get a feel for how, like, even these things that maybe we don't call fear, maybe things that we don't call resentment or selfishness or dishonesty, how they still deconstruct down. And you'll also see that in the PDF. You'll see that list in your workbook where it will show you under each category. You'll see fear, and there's a whole lot of feelings and emotions and experiences that fall under fear. Look under resentment. You'll see a whole long list of things that fall under that same canon, that same category. And so these are the things that things deconstruct down to. Now, if you are a person of faith, I hope that you will find this comparison especially interesting, because for me, as I started moving through my addiction recovery program, one of the things that I found true was that this very, very, very complicated addiction recovery program, at least to me it seemed to be at the time, really distilled down to those 2 greatest commandments. As I moved through the process, I realized, wow, it really is just about loving God all the way and really being able to spend my life serving other people all the way. Now, whether you're a person of faith or not, I'll tell you, that's still the solution. That's still the basic addiction recovery program. That's still what it distills down to. And so again, whether you are a person of faith or not, I hope that you can hold that in your mind for now. We'll talk more about it later. We'll talk more about it in another course as well. But that will be one end of the spectrum of where we want to go. Loving God, loving other people. That's where we're trying to go in our lives to have the greatest measure of peace and joy. Now, what are the things that pull us away from that? Now think of those 4 kind of like being placed on the other side of that, like a magnet that pull us away from that. This is where the tension is created. Addiction falls somewhere in between here. Over here we have where we're trying to spend our time, resources, and our purpose in being in line with our higher power, who has a great plan for us, our daily lives, our families, those who love us, those that we love. He has plans for us. He has plans for each of them, and he's working behind the scenes to try to make all of those things happen along the course of the story that he has written. He's got plans. He has resources to make those plans happen. Now, we get in the way sometimes and we can kind of mess things up. Now, not so much that we'll ever ruin his plan, right? Never. We don't have the power to derail God, for sure. However, we do get in the middle of things when we start to look over his shoulder and be like, well, what are you doing over there, God? I'm not sure I like the way that you're doing that. So when we get into that place where we are trying to tell God how to do his job, or we have feelings about how he's doing his job, or we're afraid he's not going to do his job, or we think we're supposed to do his job, all of those things can create a lot of pain in our lives. And that is, again, that falls somewhere between these two. That's where a lot of the tension comes again. Tension comes from in our lives. So again, over here we have God and other people. Over here we have those 4 triggers: fear, resentment, selfishness, and dishonesty, that are acting like magnets pulling us away from that. So this is a kind of the visual that I want you to have as we move through the rest of this course to understand, because it doesn't, when we talk about the 4 triggers, I know it's tempting to feel like maybe we've oversimplified it here, but we've only oversimplified it the same way that we've oversimplified this idea of 2 great commandments, thousands of commandments that come up to these 2. It's kind of like, if you can understand these 2, just go that direction and you'll be okay. And similarly, if you can understand these 4 triggers and how everything deconstructs down to those, then you'll start to see those big forces that are working in your life to cause you pain and to create tension and to put you in a place where you are so uncomfortable, all you need is relief. Now, I'll tell you, this is a little bit of a spoiler. What do you need for relief? Well, what you need for relief is, when you have those 4 triggers pulling you this way, well, what you need for relief is to go a little bit back this way. Easier said than done. Go back to loving God. Go back to other people. That's easier said than done. I'm someone who is a person of faith, and I spent my whole life living, I thought that way. I thought I was living in a way that loved God all the way. I thought I was living in a way that loved other people all the way. But I also was someone who was chronically haunted by those 4 triggers. I lived my life riddled with them, riddled with the fear and the resentment. I was being controlled by the selfishness and dishonesty moving through my life. Those don't look the way you think they will. I promise they affect you more than you think they do. Hang on for the next series that is coming in just a few videos from now. And so what I want you to recognize here is that just recognizing that you can deconstruct things down to that 4 will be very empowering for you. We don't always have to know what's going on all of the time, but it is nice when we have a little bit of a clue, right? Definitely, for sure. Especially because we all find ourselves in situations regularly that we don't know what to do next. We also find ourselves in situations regularly that we feel so emotionally uncomfortable that it's hard to do the next thing that's being given to us to do. Whatever that is. Maybe we're stuck in traffic and we're so emotionally dysregulated by the frustration of being stuck in traffic when we're in a hurry to get where we have to go, that by the time we get where we were trying to go in the first place, we're so undone that we can't even focus on the job at hand. Whatever it is, we find ourselves in these situations all the time. So in the course of these next videos, what we're going to do is take a really close look at how these 4 triggers touch our lives and really do kind of affect our ability to show up and do the next thing that we have to do. Now, what is the next thing that we have to do? Well, I could give you an example of 1,000 different things, a million different things. You could give me a different example of thousands and millions of different things that maybe you will have to do next. From your life, from mine, from your neighbor's life. It's going to look different all the time. And that, again, is why it's so nice to be able to simplify it back to, well, what are the 2 greatest commandments and how does it apply to that? Whatever we're doing next, we always want to know how can it apply and help us to keep those first 2 great commandments of loving God and loving other people. That's what we want to be able to do in all of our affairs throughout our life. Because when we live in that place, we're being able to live in a place where we feel free from all of our emotional dysregulation. We are in alignment with the highest possible way that we could be living. Now, and the reason why that is because we are in a place where we're no longer trying to do God's job. We're no longer questioning the way that he does it. Now, that takes time, that takes practice, and it'll probably take a couple more courses for you to go through. But for now, this is the best place for us to start, for us to get in a little more deeply into what those 4 triggers are and how they show up in your life. Now, as promised, I told you that I'd come back and give you an example about one that we can talk about now. Now, the example I'm going to give is going back to the one I gave you just before this video, which was actually the jealousy and the powerlessness that I was experiencing in my life. Now let's revisit them again. I use them to explain to you how we have these experiences that happen in our life, things we can control, things that we can't control, and how we can move through them. Well, now let's look at those, because jealousy and powerlessness, that doesn't sound like any of the 4 triggers that I just named, but I just explained to you how they were triggers for me. So let's talk about it. How does jealousy break down into those 4 triggers? Now, what you'll find is that all of the examples I give you may or may not touch on all 4, but sometimes they will, sometimes they won't, sometimes it'll be just one. In these instances, you'll see how they kind of combine to create the experience of jealousy. They kind of combine to create the experience of powerlessness. So in my example, when I was feeling jealous, where was I afraid? Well, this is how fear applied. Jealousy is the fear of losing something that belongs to you. Something that belongs to you, you feel like it's being threatened by someone or something else. There you go, that's fear. Well, how does that apply to resentment? You better believe I had a little bit of resentment for the person and thing that I felt like was threatening something that I felt like belonged to me. What about selfishness? What about dishonesty? Well, we'll get more into the definitions of those as we go into these next videos, but I was being selfish in the sense that I was being consumed by my feelings of fear and resentment to the point where I wasn't really useful to the people around me. I was thinking about this so much that I was so consumed that I was not showing up as good of a friend as I could have been, or as good as a mom, or as good of an employee, because I was really busy spending a lot of time and energy on that scenario. And then what about dishonesty? Well, I had told myself a big story that wasn't true. And that story was all about what was going to happen if this and this and that happened. These were things that hadn't happened. And by the way, they're things that never did happen. But I made up this whole big story in my brain. And then I had a lot of feelings about it. So jealousy absolutely deconstructs down to those 4 triggers. Now, the other one, an example that I gave you in the last video, was powerlessness. So how does powerlessness, how does that involve the 4 triggers? Well, let's go through them one by one. Fear, powerlessness, and fear. What is the relationship? What do you think the relationship is? Feel free to pause this video and think about it for a second if you want to. Feel free to pause the video and think about how it might apply to all 4 of these. But let's go through it. So powerlessness and fear. Well, for me, if I'm feeling powerless, fear definitely comes into play, because I'm afraid that things are not going the way, they are not going to go the way that I feel like they need to go in order for me to feel safe, in order for me to feel like they're meeting my expectation. And then where does resentment come from? Well, in that place of powerlessness, I am resentful. I'm resentful to whatever it is that's standing in the way of me having the outcome that I want. Whatever it is that I feel like has taken away my power, my ability to control an outcome at all. And I don't say controlling in an oppressive way either. All of us want to have some semblance of control in our lives. We want to be able to anticipate what's going to happen next and be able to influence what happens next, right? Because if we can conduct those things in our life, then we can guarantee our peace. But that's just not life. We don't always have that privilege of knowing what's going to happen next. We don't always have control over everything and what the next moment is going to hold. So if I'm in a place where I feel powerless, that means I had the expectation of power, and I absolutely am going to resent whatever it is that's withholding that power from me or has it instead of me. What about selfishness? Well, for me, again, a lot of times selfishness, it's when I am just so consumed by the feelings that I'm having that I'm just lost in them and not taking the time to be considerate of those around me. I'm too busy feeling my feelings. And then dishonesty. Where does dishonesty come into play for powerlessness? Well, there are a lot of ways that it might come into play. But again, for me, often the dishonesty comes in when I create a story in my mind that isn't true. What do I think the outcome is going to be? For me, in that specific example, I felt powerless about a situation that was going on with my son. And here I am worried. How is he going to grow up? What kind of adult is he going to be? How's this going to affect who and what he is in his life as a man? He's only 9 years old right now, by the way. So when I'm putting my brain into the future and being worried about all these things that haven't happened yet, I am fabricating a reality that doesn't exist. It's not real. It's not true. So that's where dishonesty can really come in and start to distort my emotional experience and make me really dysregulated and really uncomfortable and fighting for relief somewhere, anywhere. And so that's how jealousy and powerlessness both can deconstruct down to being affected by and created by those 4 triggers: fear, resentment, selfishness, and dishonesty. I hope that's helpful. Now we're going to go into the next series of videos where we get in really deeply into what the 4 triggers are so that you can better identify them in your life.